Well, I'm just especially delighted to have this opportunity to do this video. It's something I've wanted to do for some time, but just never really had the opportunity, and but now we have the venue for it, and here we go. I was asked several weeks ago, why do you want to do this video? And I had to think about that for a minute, and here was my response. I said, well, I want to do it while my memory is still good. And as you can see, I don't have any notes. And I just want this to be like you and me having a cup of coffee together in a very relaxed situation, talking about this journey that I've been on for these few years, actually 56 years. Really, I think I had a very unique career. When you're chairman of the board twice, when you're CEO 4 different times, when you're regional president 3 times, all in the same city, to me that is fairly unique. Somebody asked me several years ago, said, Jim, I've seen your resume and I've studied it. And he said, would you tell me the secret to your success? And I want that to come across maybe in a humble kind of way. And I said, well, Chris, the answer is going to be a lot simpler than you think. Somewhere early on, I developed an ability to identify talent, hire that talent, and surround me with that talent. In a lot of cases, they were brighter than me, quicker than me, but for some reason I could help them establish goals and then get out of the way and let them achieve those goals. Now I know that kind of sounds a little bit of a textbook, but that was me. And the other reason I would give you is that of all the jobs I had, and I had a lot of jobs other than president or CEO, I had a love affair with virtually every job that I ever had. And I mean that sincerely. I mean, I can't think of any job that I somehow didn't get into and develop a love affair. They weren't all that easy. I don't know if you've ever seen a turtle on the top of a fence post, but if you have, you'll know it didn't get there by itself. It had a lot of help to get there. And I want you to know I had a lot of help in my career over 56 years. And I want to acknowledge just a few of those people before we actually get into the core part of the video. The first one I'm going to recognize is my Uncle Cecil. I wasn't very close to him growing up, but he recommended I go to SMU. And here's my SMU ring to prove it. But a good choice for me. The next is Oliver Clift in Waxahachie, Citizens National Bank AVP, who actually introduced me to the First National Bank in Dallas people. And that's where I had about a 17-year run and had a good career there. Jim Merrick was my first boss on the training program, very supportive. I could go on and on about Jim, but he was very supportive. My friend Gordon Longhorn Roberts that really encouraged me at 25 and 26 when we'd go down to the Gold Coin and have coffee. And he kept me propped up during some lean years back then. George Kilpatrick, who took me under his wing as a junior lender and taught me, and George was really non-political, but he was one of the up-and-comers, and I always considered myself non-political. and but he and I got along great. Then there was Jody Grant, who introduced me to Buzz Brightbill, and Buzz and I hooked up with Texas American Bankshares and the old Exchange Bank, which became Tab Dallas, and we worked together for 13 years, and it was a real good relationship. He and I thought a lot about the same in leadership. We were both good leaders, and I learned from him, and I hope maybe he'll learn a few things from me. Then there was the First Western crowd. Bob Denson, the old security guy, got me introduced there. And this was a group of hard-nosed, very successful Jewish businessmen in Dallas who had been very successful in their own right, but absolutely had no knowledge of how to run a bank. And somehow I got hooked up through Bob, and really Harmon Sheps, Sheps Dairy was one of them, and he's the one that got on my bandwagon, and we turned that thing around, doubled the size of it, and made it a very attractive candidate to buy, which sold to Compass for a very good price. As a matter of fact, if I recall correctly, they got the highest price that had been paid for a Texas bank in years when they sold to Compass. That rolled me into George Shirley from Birmingham, and they moved him out here to be CEO of Comerica, of Compass. And George and I had a good 10-year run. Good 10-year run. That was very good. And then Jim Gardner with Commerce Street Capital. Jim introduced me to the Century Bank people in Texarkana, and they wanted to come to Dallas. And I think, if I recall what he told me was true, they'd been looking for about 6 months, and they couldn't find anybody to hire. They didn't make the right connection. They finally called Jim, and Jim said, "I'll tell you what, I'll give you one name," and that was my name, and the rest was history. Before I move on, though, I want to give recognition to my lovely wife Beverly, who's been with me. Well, this year will be 50 years, but she'd been with me almost the entire time. And she was always a great supporter. All the traveling and board meetings and conferences and schools I went to, she was always there taking care of the kids, never complained, and was always there to welcome me back. So I want to give her her due, if I can. I'd like to end up on recognition, really talking a little bit about my grandfather, Dr. J.W. Toddleson, who the family owned the Citizens National Bank here in Ennis. And he was a doctor, got his degree from Tulane, 1907, and came to Bardwell and was a doctor in Bardwell for years, although he loved the banking business, and he made investments in the bank there in Bardwell and also one in Rice, Texas. And during the 20s, though, early 20s, the bank was struggling, and he had ownership in it, and somebody advised him, said, "Doctor," said, "we're going to lose everything if you don't take that thing over." So he went in, bought a bigger piece of the bank there in Bardwell, and ran it for a good number of years, from, let's say, 1920 to 1933. 1933, if anybody knows anything about history, the country was going through a deep depression. Banks were going under every day. And my granddad got a call one night at midnight from the Federal Reserve Bank in Dallas. It said, "Doctor, we want you to come to Dallas right now. We want to talk to you." So he and my Uncle Cecil hopped in the car, drove to Dallas, and that was a long drive back in those days. The Federal Reserve wanted him to take his bank, which was the First National Bank of Bardaville. He wanted to take his bank. They wanted him to take his bank and bring it to Ennis, and merge with his Citizens Bank here in Ennis that had gone under. The president had committed suicide, and it was a mess. So they agreed to do that, and so that's how my family got to Ennis in 1933, April, and they put that together, and the Fed ended up actually propping the thing up with some bonds the way they used to do, and then they formed the new Citizens National Bank with a new charter. And I think in 1938, then they moved down the avenue. They were up on Knox and the Main at that point. Then they moved in 1943 down to the avenue, and then we owned the bank for there on out. I started down there really. I spent a lot of time as a kid down there. Really 5 years old, 6 years old. I knew almost every nook and cranny of that bank. Got my first job there when I was 14 as a bookkeeper. And I started slow, but I learned quick, and learned every back room office back there. And I had a great time. I really thoroughly enjoyed that. I would be posting books, and I'd see we had a little coffee shop right next to the bookkeepers, and when my uncle and several the key people in Ennis would come in for coffee, I'd drop what I was doing and go up there and listen to them. And some of them were directors of the bank, and they were all the leaders in town at that point. But I spent every summer and every Saturday working there. One of the things that I learned there at the bank was to start early. And I did start early. I would arrive, I had a key to the front door. I would arrive early, open the vault. I knew the combination, get the books out, get everything ready to post, and make coffee, generally before anybody else got there. And that mode of operation stayed with me throughout my entire career. I was always known when I was in town that I would be the first one at the bank. And I generally was. You know, certain things happen to you in life that you think are bad, and many times they turn out to be a blessing. And that is what happened to me, and I want to share that on the video. It was the late spring of 1959. I was in finals in my freshman year at SMU. And I got a call from my mother. And she said, Cecil called, and he doesn't have a job for you this summer in the bank. Boy, that was a gut shot if there ever was, because I was really planning on that job and the money. So I immediately finished finals and went down to the three biggest banks in town, Mercantile, First, and Republic, and put in for a job for the summer. Of course, it was late. There it was, late May. To no avail. They didn't have anything. So my dad actually got me a little job with Southern Pacific Railroad. Doing what, I have no idea. But I came home, visited with my grandfather, and he apologized. He said, you know, I'm sorry that it worked out this way, but he said I just didn't have any control over it. And I understood. But he said, why don't you go over and talk with Oliver Clift? Well, I'd never even heard of Oliver Clift at the Citizens National Bank of Waxahachie. But when you're desperate, you'll do almost anything. So I hopped in the car and drove over to Waxahachie and walked into the bank. The bank was then on the corner there across from the courthouse. Walked up, introduced myself, told him who I was, and I was looking for a summer job. He was very nice. I remember him as a very, very nice fellow. He was EVP in the bank and ex-mayor of Waxahachie. He told me, he said, son, we just don't have anything for the summer. And of course my heart sank. But he said, wait a minute, hold on a second. And that's when he turned his chair around to his credenza and made a call on his rotary black phone. He was talking to somebody, I had no idea who. He hung up, turned right back around and looked at me and said, Mr. H.J. Blackwell at the First National Bank in Dallas will see you at 2 o'clock. That was the end of the conversation. I thanked him and I left, and I showed up, of course, at Mr. Blackwell's office. I didn't realize he was the number 3 guy in the bank at the time. He was a very powerful guy. And he introduced me to Sam Holmes, and from there I went into commercial books, and I had a job every summer from then on. 1968 was a banner year for me at First National Bank in Dallas. I was promoted to officer, which was a big deal back in those days. I was promoted by Jim Merritt to the senior analyst over all the other analysts, which was really my first management job, I guess, that I had. But the real highlight of that year was signing up for the American Institute of Banking National Public Speaking Contest. Now, I didn't know much about the contest, but it was almost a whim that I signed up. But I thought, I'll give this a whirl. The speaking contest was started by A.P. Giannini in 1926, who founded the Bank of America in California. And he did it really to promote banking and also to promote public speaking in banking. Well, I signed up. The first contest was the local in February of 1968. It was on a cold, dreary Saturday morning I'll never forget. Went down to the Mercantile Auditorium on the 3rd floor. Got there a little bit before 9 o'clock. It was locked, nobody was there. Well, I went back downstairs, and I remember vividly standing at the corner of Main and Akron at 9 o'clock in the morning saying, do I really want to do this? Maybe I'll just get in my little Volkswagen and go home. But I didn't. I turned around and went back up to the 3rd floor, and the judges were then there. Guess what? There weren't any other contestants. Nobody showed up. So I won that one by default. So I said, well, check that. It's been fun, because then I went to district. Well, I get to district, and there was a lot more competition. Bankers from 3 states, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Texas were there. But I knew who the competition was. He was a good-looking guy from the Liberty Bank in Oklahoma City. He was 4 years older than me. His name was Homer Paul. and he looked like a movie star. He had kinky blonde hair, and he was there to win that thing, I'll tell you, to win that prize. And he exuded confidence. Well, we had the contest, and I won first, and he won second. I didn't mention this earlier, but I should have. The topic was management development, which was really down, sort of, as it turns out, down my alley. Well, I won first and he won second, and then from there we went to regional. Well, at regional, there were 13 states represented, all down the South. Competition was stiff. Took all day. I won first and he won second. At that point, he put his arms around me and he said, "I didn't hear you, but I know you must be pretty good." And from there I went on to New York for the National, which was held in May at the National Convention. I was Speaker C, which meant I went third up, and there were 4 of us competing. 1 from California, 1 from New Jersey, 1 from Kentucky, and me from Texas. And this was held really at the very beginning of the National Convention. And there were 800 people in the audience, which meant 1,600 eyes on you. And I was very pleased with what I did. I didn't know how I did. I didn't know what the competition, I didn't hear any of the competitors. But I placed second, and I wasn't that disappointed because I placed second. And one of the judges told me, "I voted for you, and I think you should have won." But I felt so good about placing second in the nation. I was the first Texan, first Texas banker to ever reach the finals on a contest that started in 1926. So I was pretty pleased with that. Came home, I got a fair amount of recognition. I was at the bank, that separated kind of me from the boys, if you will. And that really helped my career from then on out. Almost every job I had over those 56 years was some kind of problem or a turnaround. If you just look at it, and I guess and that really augured well for me, I think, in my ability to succeed, because that's how you get promoted. That's how you get raises and bonuses and all, by solving problems. And I could do it through people. You take First National, which I guess was the first big turnaround, was the credit training program. Oh, it was in terrible shape. Oh, I fired the first guy. I came in on a Monday and I fired the first guy on Friday. That's how bad it was. Discipline was poor. So I had a big job, and we had 40 trainees there. And it took me a while to get that done. But then if you look at the old Exchange Bank, where I joined with Buzz Brightbill out there, that bank was in terrible shape. Bad loans, bad management, big bank, but it never made any money. And so that was a turnaround situation. If you look at the First Western bank shares, they were in trouble. As a matter of fact, the regulators had told them, said, "We're dropping your rating from a 2 to a 3, and it may go from a 3 to a 4 unless you get a change in management in here." And of course that augured well for me, because I was the perfect fit for them. Little side story. I had not met these people before, but they set the first meeting out at Pearl Vision. Stanley Pearl was one of the main stockholders. Everybody's heard of Pearl Vision. Well, this was Stanley Pearl. About 10 minutes before I was to interview with them out on Walnut Hill Lane, no, Royal Lane. The most horrendous rainstorm came through that you ever saw. It was unbelievable, and I had no raincoat. I had no umbrella, and it was just raining cats and dogs. And I remember I pulled up at the designated hour, and I got out of my car, and I stepped in a puddle of water about that thick. But this was, let me tell you, got in my shoes, you know, I was drenched. But you know, that settled me down. And I still remember, I said, oh, to hell with it. I'm just going to go in and see what happens. And I was as relaxed as you can't imagine because of that, okay? But I remember in interviewing these guys, and this was the last interview, they interviewed me once, and this was the third interview. They had me in a little office, Mitchell Rosansky's office, and every director had me circled like this, and they were all firing questions, all at the same time. If you kind of know Jewish people, and I do, they all like to talk at the same time. That's not against them. I'm just saying that's just part of their nature. And they were firing questions right and left. And here I was right in the center. I'll never forget, I told them, I said, well, guys, let me tell you, we've had a good meeting here. And it sounds like to me that I'm the leader you need. But I said, I'm going to tell you something my granddaddy told the Federal Reserve in 1933. He said, I'll take it over. And he said, I don't even care what my title is, but I'm going to run it. And that's what I told them. And they hired me, and it was a good a good time. Tough. It was tough, but it was good. And financially, it was very profitable for Beverly and me coming out of that deal. Very profitable. So, first Dallas with George Kilpatrick, and then they came back and asked me after 3 years on the loan floor to take over the credit training program, which had fallen on the hard times. And it was a turnaround. And the first year was rough, but the second year I made any number of trips to around the country, to New York, Chicago, North Carolina, looked at training programs, came back and revamped the whole thing. And I'm very proud of what we did, because in about 2 years we had the best training program, bank training program in the state, bar none. And one of the things I was really proud of, Jim Berry, who was running Republic at that time, called Bobby Stewart one day at a conference that they were at, and he said, "What are y'all doing in your training program over there?" He said, "We used to be able to hire all the sharp guys, and now we can't hire anybody." And of course, it was due to that training program, I think. And of course, I had taken over college recruiting as well from personnel, because they didn't know what they were doing. And so we had it all together. Went into correspondent banking. I'd done my job in credit, and I went to correspondent banking in 1976. And that was a good outing. I was division head and had everything between Dallas and Chicago, west, all the way to California. Had 5 guys working for me, had a lot of travel involved. But then in July of that year, Texas American came calling and hired me, and that's where I hooked up with Buzz Brightfield. Went out to the old Exchange Bank, which is the 5th largest bank in town. It was in trouble. It was a turnaround. Had no goals. Had a lot of bad loans on the books. And it took us several years to hire the right people and get all that going, but we did. And the results speak for themselves. And by 1980, it was a genuine machine. And Buzz got a reward because he was given the presidency of the holding company out of that. And with his departure back to Fort Worth, I became president and CEO. And that gave me a lot of visibility and recognition in Dallas. I ended up going on several boards. We were beginning to expand Dallas, and we were beginning to buy some other banks over here, and those were all under my venue, if you will. 80, 81, 82, we just hit our goals, and things were highly motivated. In 1982, they asked me to go to New York and Boston and speak to the security analysts up there. We were in the process, TAB I'm talking about, going on the New York Stock Exchange. And because of our success in Dallas, they wanted to highlight that to the security analysts. So that was a real highlight for me, to fly up there with that crew and to do that. 83 was successful, 84, but funny thing, we were all making our goals, but we didn't realize what was happening to us, because the banking market was changing and the energy business was in decline. And by 85, I gave up the CEO to somebody else and was simply doing holding company work. And by that time, I was executive vice president in the holding company of Texas American Bankshares. And the rumors were, now this was just a rumor, but the rumors were I was headed to Fort Worth to head up the lead bank. Well, by 86, things really began to get rough. And our president and CEO there in Dallas resigned. I assumed that position again. And from 86 to 89, we were just in recovery or trying to survive. At this point, I wanted to add a little color to what the Texas banking situation was back in those days. You see, Texas banking never had branch banking. Texas was one of the few states that did not have branch banking, and that goes all the way back to the Constitution that was signed in 1876. And one of the reasons that over the years that occurred is that the legislature was really controlled by the small towns, rural towns, and small counties in Texas. So the big banks did not have the clout to get branch banking done. The banks didn't want it, small banks. In 1956, they passed a holding company act, 1956. And then in 1970, they made some amendments to it, which allowed the larger banks to start buying up small banks. Before that, you could only own 24.9% of any other bank. But once they did that amendment, then that formed the holding company movement in Texas. TAB, incidentally, was the first banking company to form a holding company, and they did that in 1970. During the 70s, the whole landscape of banking changed. Texas was on a roll. The economy was good. Energy was very, very good. The energy business, the banks were well run. As a matter of fact, Wall Street had really picked up on the Texas banking scene back during the 70s. And at 12/31 of 82, I still remember this, of the total capitalization market capitalization of banks on Wall Street. Out of the top 5, 4 were in Texas. The only one outside of Texas was Morgan Guaranty in New York, and they were number 1. All the others were in Texas. A lot of people forget that little piece of trivia. By 1983, the end of 83, however, the landscape had changed dramatically. Showed you how quick things can change. It was unbelievable. In 1981, I want to just mention this, 1981, Congress passed the Garn Bill, which allowed the savings loan industry to become bankers. Big mistake. Huge mistake by the government. It allowed incompetent management and crooks to get into the savings loan industry, and they devastated that industry. I remember vividly, we're in an executive meeting on the 16th floor in Fort Worth at TAB, and our steely-eyed chairman, Lewis Bond, asked, there were only about 6 of us around the table, asked us, what should we be doing? What should we be thinking? And to a man, everybody said, well, we just need to kind of keep keeping on. We need to be conservative, but let's just keep keeping on. But when it got to me, and I'm not normally a contrarian, but I looked at Lewis and I said, Lewis, Continental Illinois in Chicago is just going under. Last year, the First National Bank in Midland went under. Most of the banks in Midland and Odessa are either going under or fixing to go under. InterFirst Corporation out of Dallas just announced the largest quarterly loss last October in banking history, almost $300 million. I think we need to batten down the hatches and let the storm clear. I'll never forget, those are almost my exact words to him. And he looked at me and he said, Jim, I appreciate those comments, but he said, we're a public company and we can't do that. He said, the oil business will come back. And with that, we kept keeping on. Now the energy loans were running off, and we'd pretty well covered that. The ag loans were running off, so where were we going to put our money? Put it in real estate. All the banks were doing that, putting it in real estate. Developers were going strong, and of course a lot of this was fueled also by what the savings loan people were doing. They were doing crazy stuff, and of course it wrecked the industry, as we will remember. But what we didn't realize is that by 1986, the price of oil just fell out and went to almost $10 a barrel. And we didn't realize that the Congress was going to pass the Tax Reform Act of 1986, which absolutely killed the real estate industry. Our values on our portfolio were dropping by 30 to 50%. Nobody can sustain that. The FDIC out of Washington, D.C. had indicated, hey, if you're in trouble, come in early and talk to us. And we did that in 1986. Went in, talked to them, laid it all out, and we still had plenty of capital. We were still a strong company at that point. We talked to them for 3 years. And every time it seemed like we got to the goal line, the goalpost moved. Typical government kind of thing. And we never got there. So July the 20th, 1989 was our last day. I guess the low point of my career might be when the FDIC and the OCC came in and took over the bank in July of 1989. We were the last major bank to go under in Texas. And I remember it vividly. I was having lunch at Brook Hollow Golf Club with an attorney, and I get a call, and it was the OCC and FDIC had come in. Well, I show up, and boy, they're a couple of nervous guys. I tell you, they'd never gone through anything like that. So I pulled them and our chief operating officer into a conference room, and I remember it vividly. I said, "Guys, you're here to do a job. We're going to cooperate in every way we can with you, so don't worry about it." Boy, you would have thought I had relieved them of a lot of pressure. I'll tell you. I ended up with a job out of that deal. I ran all the community banks for the new owners, but it was going to be short-lived, and so I had an option to stay with the company at the year end, or to take a pretty lucrative severance package, and I took that. Banking in 1990, January of 1990, was pretty bad in Texas. It was cold, I'm telling you. It was really cold. And I thought we were going to have to leave the state, sell out, go to wherever, or get out of banking. That's what a lot of people were doing back then. But then I had an opportunity to get introduced to that First Western crowd that I mentioned, and it was right down my alley. They were all successful in their own right. They were all trying to run the bank together, but they had no idea what they were doing. So I came in as the catalyst and told them, just back off and let me do my thing. And I hired a few people, key people, and we turned it around. We doubled it in size and put us on the radar to be sold. And then Compass came along and made a very lucrative offer to them and bought it. And that's when I joined Compass as executive vice president. I remember sitting down with Charles McMahon, who was running Texas at the time, and he said, "Jim," he said, "the top 2 spots are filled up here, but," he said, "would you take on the commercial lending job here?" Said, "We've been fighting it up here for 2 years, and we only got $5 million on the books." I said, "Yeah, I'll take that." And at the end of the first year, we were $50 million in commercial loans. Next year, we were $100 million. And of course, all I did was just go out and hire the right people and surround myself with them. And as I talked about earlier, during that time, George Sherling gave me energy, real estate, and retail lending. So I had the whole lending side under me, and I did that for 5 years. Then the chairman retired of of Compass, and they asked me to take his role. I didn't take his title. That was some politics, and I didn't take his title, but I took his role as over the both boards. We had 2 boards. And I did government relations, flying to Austin, Washington, and that was more of a lobbying trip, more of a lobbying job, if you say. And I did that for 4 years, and unbeknownst to me, Charles wanted to replace all the top 3 people at Compass. We'd hit every goal, and there was some jealousy involved in that. So I retired out of Compass, and didn't realize that George was going to get retired too, and the chief credit officer was going to get retired too, but we all got retired. And the old First Western crowd had cranked up a new bank called First Independent, It had never done well at all, and they'd been trying to hire me for 2 years, but they couldn't afford me. Anyway, they did hire me this time, and they'd never made a profit. In 2 years, they'd never made a profit. And I came in, did my kind of the same thing I did at First Western. We got it turned around. Within 2 months, we began to make money, and we tripled the size of the bank. And then that's when Jim Gardner called me and said that Century wanted to come to Dallas. And I flew up and I joined Century. And this was great. They didn't have a thing here, but they gave me total carte blanche. I could do anything I wanted to do. And I hired a lot of really key people, and we began to build from there. And we built it up to 15 branches and about a little less than 500 million in assets. And that was a real plus. As I mentioned earlier, the Century Bank thing was really something. We took that from virtually nothing up to almost 500 million in 15 branches in Dallas in 3 years. The market couldn't believe it. The board in Texarkana was giddy. The chairman was giddy. As a matter of fact, they were so taken with Dallas that he and his wife, the chairman and his wife, moved to Dallas, bought a mansion in Highland Park, and moved all their extended family into Highland Park. Her daughter, her husband, his son, all the grandkids, everybody moved to Highland Park. Everybody was giddy except Little Joe. And Little Joe was president and CEO in Texarkana, and he felt left out. Now, I didn't see it. I didn't see it coming, but I found out later. Joe thought that I was going to get his job because we had done such a phenomenal job in Dallas. And we had. And I will tell you, we had real chemistry. I remember when we cranked that thing up at the outset, I had people coming to me that some I'd known for years and others I didn't know, and boy, these were talented people, and they all wanted to go to work for us. I mean, it was quite a, and to do that in 3 years, the market couldn't hardly believe it. But Little Joe, who was like a son to the chairman, got with the chairman's wife, who really had never cared for me because she couldn't control me. She was the chairman's trophy wife. She would come to Dallas and go into branches and literally scare people, part of her nature. I mean, she had a very intimidating personality. I remember twice the chairman came to me and said, well, he said, you know, we just don't think this lady's going to work out. Well, I knew where that was coming from, because she was, they were both attractive, and she was afraid that the chairman was going to be attracted to them. So she wanted to get rid of them. Well, I refused. I said, we're not going to do that. And we never got into any of the details. I just said, I'm not going to do that. It's not right, I'm not going to do it. So eventually she and Little Joe got together and made sure I was going to exit. The marketplace couldn't believe it. But, you know, it is what it is. And it was a little brutal because they wanted to give me a very mediocre severance. And they had allowed me to buy into the bank, and they were going to give me 20% of what the stock was worth. Well, I wasn't going to let that stand. I mean, this is a little bit like a David and Goliath story. But I went to see a good friend of mine, Dan Hartsfield, who was a labor lawyer, And he looked at it and he said, I've never seen anything like this. One funny thing, I had a contract. I went in with a 3-year contract, and they let it expire. And I never asked any questions about it, but I thought it was unusual that they never brought it up. Well, because they didn't bring it up, they didn't realize what the Texas law was. If you have a contract and it's not formally rescinded in Texas, under the law, it renews. They didn't realize that. So my contract renewed, all the options, all the salary, all the bonuses. So all of a sudden I went from no leverage to having a lot of leverage. I let my attorney Dan work out all the details, and I left there. I could have taken him to court probably, but I didn't want to do that. I didn't want that kind of reputation, and so they came across fairly on the stock. I got a 30% premium on the stock and a nice severance. Little Joe ended up coming to Dallas like he wanted. I was gone. But they never got the chemistry right. The chemistry, they lost it. People were leaving. He couldn't control it. And within a year, they sold Wells Fargo at a very reduced price. I didn't feel bad. They didn't get what they wanted. They should have kept what they had and kept it on a roll. After I left Century, I was immediately contacted by First Community out of Houston. They had heard about our success at Century, and they knew about my background. And so they wanted to hire me to duplicate what we had done at Century. They had raised $100 million of equity money out of New York, and they were ready to expand across the state. The timing was not good on that, though. This was '07, and we didn't realize what was coming in '08 with what we termed the Great Recession. But anyway, they hired me. We cranked up in Dallas, and the same thing. People started coming to me, hey, can I go to work for you? I hired 3 of the lenders out of Century who didn't want to stay there any longer. The chairman and CEO was a fellow named Nigel Harrison. And Nigel had put together a little small holding company in Houston back in the 90s. Again, timing was excellent for him. It wasn't very large, but he sold to Wells Fargo when Wells wanted to come into Texas for a huge price. And all of a sudden, Nigel was viewed as a genius. Well, timing has a way of either making you a genius or not a genius. Anyway, he had raised this $100 million, and that's what the group in New York was looking at. So we had a lot of money to play with. And I was given almost, again, carte blanche in Dallas to do pretty well what I wanted, hire who I wanted, put the branches in, except the management in Houston was weak. These were not bankers that I was used to. They would show up at 9 o'clock in the morning, work for about 30 minutes, and then try to figure out where to go to lunch. Then they'd have a long lunch, probably on the bank, and about 4 o'clock they'd take off and go smoke cigars. Those were not the kind of bankers that I was used to working with at all. And I knew that something had to change. And of course, Nigel eventually lost his job out of that because the New York group wouldn't put up with it. They had a misfire. They hired a guy named Andy, and he was not the right fit for them. And as I have reflected back, I don't have very many regrets, but as I've reflected back, I wish I had flown to New York and sat down with the equity group and laid out a plan for how that company could survive. and what we needed to do. And I could have done that. But down deep, I felt that would be disloyal. And I didn't do that. And of course, consequently, I didn't get the opportunity to be the CEO, and I think I could have done that. I was probably too closely tied maybe with the management in Houston that had hired me, and they didn't really know me that well because I was in Dallas, and they were focusing strictly pretty much on Houston. But they hired a new CEO, and I ended up staying really another 2 years with them, but we were going through that, as I mentioned, that Great Recession. And the bank wasn't making any money, and it had to reduce in size, and I knew Dallas was probably going to be reduced. So I waited till the appropriate time and went ahead and sat down with the CEO and said, look, time for me to get probably out of here. And I could see the writing on the wall. So I left there, and in good graces, but I was glad to be out of there. You know, those of us that got into banking in the 60s consider that we got in what we call the golden era of banking. And let me kind of set a stage for that for you. In the 30s, we had the Deep Depression. And in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, banking was known as an honorable profession, but it was slow. Pay was low. Nobody made much money. Even the banks didn't make much money. Even if you owned the bank, you just kind of eked along. As a result of that, no real talent was brought into banking during the 30s, the 40s, and even the 50s. In the 60s, banking began to change, and management became much more sophisticated. The emphasis was on growth. It was on making money for their shareholders. But there was one problem. There was a tremendous void in management. And that's what people in my era in the 60s filled. It provided opportunities for us that were almost unbelievable, that we took on at late 20s, early 30s, into our 40s. We ended up with responsibilities that we would have never dreamed of. The 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and even part of let's say the first decade of the 21st century, banking was golden. Community banking came into its own. It was king. Texas banking was king during those years. Even with the debacle that we had in the late 80s, where Texas lost 9 out of the top 10 banks that we had, banking still provided a good platform to operate out of. Then came government regulation and consolidation. For years, the commercial banks, now I'm not talking about savings and loans now, I'm just talking about commercial banks, the number nationwide stood at about 14,500. And that was the way it was all the way back when I was in college, and that number stayed steady for years and years. It grew in the 90s to about 17,000. But then here came, as I mentioned, government regulation and consolidation, and that number began to dwindle, and today it's less than 5,000 nationwide. Banking has changed a great deal. It's not near what it was and never will be, I don't think. Community banking was a lot of fun. It provided a lot of opportunity, a lot of creativity, and today, really, if you look at it, really the banking market is run by the 6th or 7th largest banks in the country. And it's just going to continue to get that way. Well, that's about 56 years worth. You know, and it's been a lot of fun. Catherine asked me one time, said, well, who's your audience? Well, I don't know who my audience is going to be. I guess my kids will maybe see this, maybe the grandkids. But I think why this is important is that I think we lose so much history, you know, when things like this are not done and then people pass away and it's just gone and nobody knows. So that's one of the reasons I wanted to maybe do this. Probably nobody other than my family will even have an interest, but I've enjoyed doing it a lot. And I'm going to end up with, I kind of pulled this out of the air, I hadn't even thought about it, but kind of an old piece of history. Old bankers never die, they just lose interest and fade away.